Today's webinar, we have David Glatter from the Broward County, Florida Sheriff's Office Crime Lab presenting the effect of time on rusted firearm identification. Without further delay, here's David.
Thanks, Tom. Hello and good afternoon. My name is David Glatter. I am a criminalist with the Broward Sheriff's Office Crime Lab in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And this afternoon, I will be giving a presentation on the effect of time when making fired bullet and cartridge case identifications to rusted firearms. So what I will be discussing in this presentation today, I'm first going to start off with a little bit of background information about the topic. I will then go over some literature review. I will go over my project setup, the results of the project, any conclusions that were made, and future considerations for future work involved in this topic. So a little bit of background. Obviously, rusted firearms are a concern in Florida because we are a state that is covered in water, 18.5% covered in water, and is surrounded on three sides by two very large bodies of water, mainly the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean. We also have numerous numbers of rivers and canals and lakes that are run through for the city of Fort Lauderdale alone, where I work. So having firearms be submitted to a crime lab and be submitted in a rusted condition is something that doesn't happen on a daily basis, but does happen enough that as an examiner, I need to be able to learn or better understand how to examine and the possibilities of making a comparison. So, and it's not just a concern with agencies and labs and examiners in Florida. Every agency in the country or possibly the world has bodies of water or certain bodies of water that guns, I'm sure, have come out of, whether it's a sewer system, a lake, a river, anything. It is a concern for any examiner. Not many have explored how corrosion can affect the working surfaces of a firearm over time. And because there's such limited past research and attention, this is why I wanted to focus on for this presentation. So to go over some past literature review, there is some previous work done, but not a ton. So the first piece of literature that I came across while doing research for this project was a paper written by William and Sorensen, where 6 firearms were submerged in salt water for 20 days, and comparisons were done between the pre and the post test fired samples once the firearms were retrieved. IDs were made, but IDs were no longer made after approximately 13 to 16 days submerged. There was a paper written by J.S. Bates that outlined a simple and general method for restoring rusted firearms, but no specific firearms were mentioned in the paper, and doing comparisons between firearms was not mentioned as well. So that's something that it's good knowledge to have on how to restore rusted firearms. However, nothing was mentioned about making identifications or comparing firearms evidence. A paper written by Dominic DeNeo in 1981 involved a 6-year-old homicide case with a Ruger pistol that had a suppressor attached to it and a cartridge case left in the chamber. An identification was made to the rusted firearm using a restoration method and making the firearm operable. As I said, there was identification made, but there was not a definitive length of time known for how long the firearm had been rusting. And DeNeo himself contributes the identification to the suppressor and the suppressor being in the chamber. Both of these contributed to the bore and the barrel of the firearm still being in good condition, thus allowing identification to be possible. Another piece of literature was found written by Mr. Ron Nichols about a 12-year-old homicide case that involved an inoperable 25 auto Raven firearm that was recovered in a drainage ditch. The firearm was restored using gun solvents and brushes, and the breech face and barrel were cast after the restoration in order to be used for comparison purposes. There was an ID made to cartridge casings that were submitted as part of evidence for this case, but no IDs were made to projectiles. So again, this is a great case where IDs were made just to cartridge cases, but not projectiles. A paper written by Philip Hess and Bruce Moran involved a double homicide case with a .22 long rifle caliber Jennings that was recovered in a storm drain after a few days. The firearm was restored using Wink brand rust remover, and then test fires were able to be taken. And there was an ID made to lead bullets that were found at the scene to the firearm. However, there wasn't an exact length of time established for how long the firearm was rusting. And then the last piece of literature that I found and used was a paper written by Mr. Derek Mears, where he was able to, under controlled conditions, submerge 5 firearms in salt water and 5 firearms in fresh water for 2 weeks total. And he retrieved the firearms from the water, restored the firearms using 5 different methods, and then compared pre-rusting to post-rusting test fires. And he was able to make identifications to the firearms, but there are also several inconclusive results as well. So what I wanted to focus on for this project was, first off, how long a firearm can rust before any individual characteristics of the firearm are altered or changed enough so that an identification can no longer be made. The second thing that I wanted to focus on was, can the amount of time a firearm has been rusting be estimated based on the condition that it is found in? Pertaining to that second question, we do get asked a lot by detectives and investigators how long, the firearm could have been in the location that it was found before it was retrieved. So having a timeline on when certain parts of a firearm rust or estimate the condition of the firearm along a timeline could be useful for investigative purposes. So now I'm going to move on to how I set up my project. So these 2 firearms were the types used for the project. The gun on the left is a Smith & Wesson Sigma series, and the gun on the right is a Glock 19 or Glock series firearm. All the firearms used were firearms that were received from the Broward Sheriff's Office Property and Evidence Unit that were slated for destruction. And the reason I chose these 2 types of firearms, or these 2 manufacturers of firearms, is that A, we had plenty of them to use that are submitted to the Property and Evidence Unit all the time. They do represent common firearms that are found through the agency and in the area that I work and live. And so they'd be great representations of firearms that we get in on a daily basis for casework. And these 2 types of firearms, these 2 manufacturers of firearms, are very simple firearms that almost have the exact same features to each other, except for the type of rifling. The Smith & Wesson has conventional rifling versus the Glock, which has polygonal rifling. So as part of the project, I'm able to explore how rust affects the different types of rifling. So the goal, obviously, of this project was to rust firearms in a controlled manner and environment. And the quickest and easiest way to rust firearms, or to rust any piece of metal, is to submerge them in water. So the firearms were submerged in water that was retrieved from a river that runs right behind the Broward Sheriff's Office Crime Lab. This river feeds from the Atlantic Ocean, so it's a representative of water that is commonly found in Broward County. It's a mixture of salt and fresh water, what's commonly called brackish water. And because it's used by boats all the time, there's runoff from different businesses along the river. There are contaminants in the water. So it was overall a great representation of the water that firearms would commonly be found in and then submitted to the lab. So in order to rust the firearms were first test fired 4 times as received from Property and Evidence. I used 9mm American Eagle 115 grain full metal jacket ammunition for the 9mm firearms, and there were some 40 Smith & Wesson firearms as well. So I used 40 Smith & Wesson American Eagle 180 grain full metal jacket ammunition for those. Again, all firearms were test fired 4 times as received. In order to control the rest of the firearms, I set up 2 aquariums and filled them with the water from the river. The aquariums were donated kindly by a coworker for this purpose. The firearms were paired off. So for each pair, there was a Smith & Wesson and a Glock. And then the firearms were placed in the aquarium side by side. An aquarium bubble, fish tank aquarium bubbler was placed in each of the tanks in order to circulate the water and to simulate a natural current in the river to kind of help aerate the water to kind of get as close to river conditions as I could. And as you can see by the photo on the slide, the firearms, once placed in the tanks, quickly became very disorganized and they would not neatly stack next to each other. And so a solution was needed in order to help keep the tanks organized. And that was the use of these plastic test tube racks. The posts on the test tube racks were tall enough and had a good sized diameter to them that the firearms were able to stand with their muzzles down on the pegs on the racks. And I was able to fit approximately 5 pairs of firearms per rack. And then the racks would be put into the tanks and they would sit on the bottom. So this is a picture of what the tanks looked like as the firearms were rusting. So the firearms were allowed to rust for desired periods of time that were determined prior to the start of the project. So for instance, the first pair of firearms was allowed to rust for 2 weeks. The second pair of firearms was allowed to rust for a month. Third pair of firearms were allowed to rust for 2 months, et cetera, until all the firearms were rusted and retrieved. After the desired time period, the firearms were retrieved from the tanks. They were field stripped. They were washed and scrubbed with clean water. They were oiled and lubricated, and then they were reassembled for test firing. This is the method that was used for test firing. We have access to a water tank at the lab, so both the pre-rusting and post-rusting test fire samples were fired into the water tank, and then the test fires were retrieved and placed in these labeled kill boxes with the make, model, and serial number of the firearm to keep everything organized. And again, just like the pre-rust samples, the post-rust firearms were test fired 4 times for reproducibility. This is a comparison microscope. This was a microscope used to make the comparisons between the pre and post-rust samples. Now I'm going to discuss the results of the project. So these are pictures of the first pair of firearms that were retrieved from the aquariums after 2 weeks. As you can see that there is minor rust buildup on a majority of the components of the firearms. A lot of the rust was concentrated around the slide lock, the sights, and the ejector ports. Mostly the rust was in a thin film on the frames and on the slides. It did not adhere very well, so it was very easy to clean off. These are the pictures of the firearms after they've been restored. Both firearms were fully functional. And as you can see, as part of the pictures, there is some discoloration on the metal components, primarily the slide and barrel, but the firearms, again, were fully functional. So test fires were able to be taken as they were. These are comparison pictures between the pre-rust samples, which are the images on the left. The post-rust samples are going to be the images on the right. And what I mean by that is this part of the image is the pre-rust sample. This is the image of the post-rust sample. And then this dividing line in the middle is what we see in order to split the 2 items of evidence. So as you can see here, this is the comparison of the Smith & Wesson cartridge casings. And as you can see, there is a clear identification between the pre and the post-rust samples. The image on the bottom left is the comparison of the Glock cartridge casings at 2 weeks. And again, I was able to make an identification between the pre and the post-rust samples. The image on the top right is the comparison between the Smith & Wesson bullets and I was able to make an identification between the two. And then the image on the bottom right is the comparison between the Glock bullets. I was not able to make an identification to these bullets at 2 weeks. And as you can see by the image on the post-rust image on the right and the pre-rust image on the left, the post-rust image had large, gross, coarse stria present on it, whereas you don't see that on the pre-rust sample. These are 2 images of the firearms that were rusting for 1 month. And as you can see, there's more surface rust on them than the previous pair, but still overall, they were not bad. These are the same two firearms after they were restored. They were both fully functional. And as you can see, there's still metal discoloration on the slides and the barrels. These are the comparison images. So the image on the upper left is the Smith & Wesson cartridge case comparison, and I was able to make an ID to those samples. The image on the top right are the Smith & Wesson projectiles, and I was able to make an ID to those. And the bottom middle image is the Glock cartridge case comparison, and I was able to make an ID to those, but I did notice that there was slight distortion on the post-rust sample with some residual rust on the head of the cartridge case. I'm still able to make an ID, but I could tell that, possibly in the future, there were going to be some issues with making IDs to the Glocks. And again, at this point, I was not able to make an ID to the Glock projectiles. These were the firearms that were allowed to rust for 2 months. So again, a large increased amount of rust present on these. The Smith & Wesson action, the firearm on the left, the action moved freely. The Glock, which is the firearm on the right, the Glock was initially seized up, so I had to use force in order to disassemble the firearm. And in my line of work, force means putting it into a vice block and beating it with a hammer. These are the firearms after they were restored, even with the increased amount of rust and having to use force to disassemble the firearm, the Glock. Both firearms were functional. Again, we are seeing slide and barrel discoloration due to prolonged rust exposure. And there was evidence at this point of damage and metal pitting as well. So this is the first instance that I was able to see this. So further on down the line, I was able to anticipate that the metal would further deteriorate. So these are the comparison images for the 2-month firearms. The image on the upper left is the Smith & Wesson cartridge case comparison. I was able to make an ID to these samples. The bottom left image is the Glock cartridge case comparison, and I was able to make an ID to those samples. The image to the middle right is the Smith & Wesson projectile comparison. And at this point, I was not able to make an ID to these projectiles. And again, was not able to make an ID to the Glock projectiles at this point as well. I'm also seeing, as part of the Smith & Wesson projectiles and the Glock, I'm still seeing these noticeably coarser stria that are present on the post-rust samples compared to the pre-rust. So I know at this point that the interior of the barrel is being affected. These are the firearms that were allowed to rust for 3 months. Again, more rust buildup than previous samples. Both firearms were initially seized and non-functioning coming out of the tank. The slides would not come off freely during disassembly, so all the Glock needed was a little bit of oil, but the Smith & Wesson had to be placed in the bench of ice and forcibly disassembled. These were the firearms after cleanup. The Smith & Wesson trigger return spring, which is the spring circled in the lower left image, was broken. So the firearm would not function without this return spring. Both firearms were inoperable, with both suffering issues with the sear engaging the striker, which is the part of the firearm that allows the firearm pin to go back and then forward again. And the recoil springs I saw started to fuse together, the individual links. So they were still working at this point, but they would probably not work over multiple rounds fired. So at this point, due to inoperable parts, reference firearms had to be used for test firing. What I mean by that is working parts from laboratory reference guns were used in conjunction with the rusted components from the rusted guns in order to make the firearms operable and to give the ability to gather test fires. These are the comparison photos for the 3-month firearms. The upper left-hand corner is the comparison for the Smith & Wesson cartridge casings. I was able to make an ID to these samples. The bottom left image is the comparison for the Glock cartridge cases. And at this point, at 3 months, I was not able to make an ID to the Glock sample. So there was little agreement between the stria and detail that I saw, and I was not able to make an ID to the Smith & Wesson projectiles, which are pictured middle right, and I was still not able to make identification to the Glock projectiles. At this point, the only IDs that I was still able to make were to the Smith & Wesson cartridge casings. So these are the firearms that were allowed to rust for 4 months. Both actions of the firearms were seized up and force was needed to open and disassemble them. There was a lot of rust buildup in the barrel, as well as excessive corrosion was visible on the Glock firearms breech face. Due to this, I can expect to see significant changes to the Glock breech face, which would then transfer over to the post-rust cartridge casing samples. These are what the firearms look like after they were restored. The firing mechanisms for both firearms were not functional. The Smith & Wesson trigger return spring, again, at this point, had disintegrated. There was a lot of pitting and damage to slides. As you can see by the image of the Glock on the right, that large kind of dip in the slide, that's all metal deterioration. The Smith & Wesson recoil spring showed signs that it was falling apart. So at this point, again, reference firearms were used to test fire the firearms. These are the images of the comparisons done for the 4-month firearms. There was slight distortion of the detail for the Smith & Wesson cartridge casings with some residual rust residue. There was some distortion of detail, but I was still able to make an identification. And I was still not able at this point to make identifications to the Glock cartridge casings, the Smith & Wesson projectiles, or the Glock projectiles. And as you can see by the image on the bottom left, which is a comparison of the Glock cartridge casings, there is significant difference between the detail present. You see a lot of heavy pitting on the cartridge case to the right, which is the post-rust sample, compared to the one on the left, which is the pre-rust. So this proves that there is damage and changes occurring to the Glock breech face. So unfortunately, there are no pre-rust pictures of the 5-month firearms. They were lost while putting the project and presentation together. But these are the images of the firearms after they were restored. Just like some of the others, both firearms were initially seized up. Both firearms had recoil spring failures, which made disassembly incredibly difficult. The Glock slide lock, which is the little piece of metal on the frame that allows the slide to lock to the rear. The spring for that slide lock fell out and failed. The firing mechanisms were functional, which was surprising, but reference firearms still had to be used in order to collect test fires. So again, these are the images of the comparisons for the 5-month firearms. I was able to make an identification to the Smith & Wesson cartridge casings, which are found in the image to the left. And to my surprise, I was able to make an identification to the Smith & Wesson projectiles at this point, which is the image on the upper right. I'm not quite sure at this point why I wasn't able to make them for the last couple of pairs, and I was able to make it at this point, but I had some theories and they will be hopefully explained towards the end of this presentation. At this point, I was also still not able to make identification to the Glock cartridge casings or to the Glock projectiles. These were the firearms that were left to rust for 6 months. Again, you're starting to see the same thing, heavy buildup of rust. The Glock firing mechanism was not functional. The Smith & Wesson action was not initially seized, but there was an issue between the engagement of the sear and striker, which caused the trigger to not reset. After they were cleaned up, both of the recoil springs for both firearms fell apart, as you can see by the images on the lower part of the slide, which are images of both the recoil springs. And again, reference collection firearms had to be used to test fire these firearms. So here are the comparison images for the 6-month firearms. I'm still able to make a clear identification to the Smith & Wesson cartridge casings and clear identification to the Smith & Wesson projectiles through the image present on the slippage. I'm still at this point not able to make an ID to the Glock cartridge casings or to the projectiles. So here are the conclusions for this project. I was not able to make an ID for the Glock projectiles at and after 2 weeks. And I was not able to make identifications for the Glock cartridge casings at and after 3 months. For the Smith & Wesson, I was able to make identifications for both the projectiles and the cartridge casings up until 6 months. So potentially I could keep making identifications for an unknown period of time if the project was able to continue, but due to time restraints for this project, I was not able to continue it at this time. The reason I was not able to make an identification for the Smith & Wesson projectiles between 2 and 4 months was potentially due to corrosion having a greater effect on the bore surface for those 3 particular firearms. There could be somehow a different metal composition than the others that were used as part of the project. I'm not exactly sure, but these are potential guesses on why the corrosion had a greater effect on the bores for those particular firearms. And to answer the second part of the question that I wanted to discuss, there were noticeable patterns of corrosion and its effect on function. For firearms rusting shorter than 3 months, all the firearms were physically in good shape with mild to medium surface rust accumulation, which was easily cleaned off. There was discoloration and minor metal deterioration present on the metal components, primarily the slides and the barrels. But in the end, all firearms at 3 months, or that were shorter than 3 months, were functional. Starting at 3 months, you were starting to see small parts of the firearm, such as recoil springs, trigger springs, were becoming brittle and falling apart rather easily. There were definitely heavier rust deposits on the firearm, causing firearms to seize. And at this point, reference firearm frames and components had to be used for test firing these firearms. By 5 months and beyond, recoil springs were completely disintegrating, which made disassembly very challenging, as well as there was just greater buildup of rust and greater chances of the firearms not being functional coming out of the tanks. So just as part of the project, I had 1 or 2 additional firearms that I submerged in the tanks just in case they were needed for the project. One of these firearms was this Ruger-made firearm. And as I was putting together the data and putting together the project after all the firearms were allowed to rust, this firearm was allowed to rust for 8 months, so 2 months longer than the other firearms. And as you can see by these images, the one on the left is of the firearm just coming out of the tank after 8 months, and the one on the right is the firearm after being restored. Same story as the other ones, heavy rust deposits, metal deterioration, but the decocker, which is this lever on the back of the firearm, that was not functional, which is a safety feature of the firearm, but the firearm was still functional coming out of the tank after being restored. So these are the images of the Ruger firearm comparison between the pre-rust and the post-rust samples. The image on the left is of the cartridge casing, and the image on the upper right is of the projectiles. I was able to make clear identifications to these samples for both the cartridge casings and the projectiles, which means this firearm, I could potentially make IDs if it was rusting for longer. And just to emphasize what the corrosion is potentially doing to the pre-chase of these firearms, the image on the lower right is of the pre and post-rust samples, the post-rust on the left of the image, the pre-rust on the right, those are the cartridge casings from the Glock firearm that was allowed to rust for 6 months. And as you can see, and as was, predicted, there is heavy damage and corrosion occurring to the breech face of that Glock. And it is significantly changing the detail and characteristics of that breech face. So now I want to discuss some future considerations on what could be done with this topic. The first one is time. More specifically, more time. I was limited to the amount of time I could spend on this project because it was part of a larger training program that I was participating in. If I was allowed to rust these firearms or similar firearms for longer periods of time, I could get different data than I did, or extend the project out further to see if maybe at some point, for instance, the Smith & Wesson firearms, I would not be able to make an identification to them at 8, 9, 10, 11 months down the line. Or maybe they're just that type of firearm that I could always make identifications to. Same thing with the Ruger firearm. Just more time would see if I can make identifications. The second consideration is the type of water. I happen to use the water that was available and is common in my area. We could repeat the project with purely fresh water, with purely salt water, with water from a stagnant lake compared to the river that I use. Examiners in different states or different parts of the country or different parts of the world could conduct this project and this research with water that's commonly found in their area, with the same firearms, to see if they came up with similar results. In addition, we could measure the pH of the water or try to get better data on specifically what in a sample of water could possibly affect these firearms. That was not done for this project, but it's something that could be considered for future projects on this topic. And the third thing were different firearms. As I stated in this presentation, I chose the two types of firearms I did because they were common to my area and I had an abundance of them to use for this project. There are numerous different manufacturers and types of firearms and different firearms that are made out of different metals that could be used in this type of project. And if this project would be replicated and could be replicated, different firearms should be used to see if similar or different results were obtained. So to sum up this presentation, I would like to give some acknowledgments and thanks. I would like to thank my coworkers at the Broward Sheriff's Office Crime Lab in the firearms section for helping me out with this project, especially while I was off doing other parts of my training program. I would also like to thank Sheila Hopkins and Jody Marcinopoli with NFEA, as well as Wendy Gibson from the Virginia Department of Forensic Science for assisting me with the project topic and allowing me to do the project in the first place. This would not have been possible without them. These are the references that I used for this project and for this presentation. So thank you very much, everybody, for allowing me to present today. Are there any questions?
All right. Thank you, David, for that fantastic informative presentation. Let's go ahead and get right into some questions. We had a very lively audience, so we've got plenty to work through. First one I have here, was there a way to have conducted the experiment protocol in the actual brackish water with the normal current behind the Broward County Crime Lab while keeping the firearms secure and safe from the public?
So that's a very good question. And it was something that I tried to consider. But unfortunately, because of the nature of the firearms were at one point items of evidence that were submitted to the crime lab or to the sheriff's department that could have potentially been used in crimes and, of course, as evidence. That really wasn't an option to do, just in case, for some reason, even if we tried to secure them as well or as thoroughly as possible, if those firearms were to get stolen or get back out into the public, that would be something that was not even possible or possibly considered. So no, at this point, I was not able to do that with the river with the water that I used. But I know that if somebody wants to try to replicate this project with a private stream or private river on their own property, their own private property, that would be something great and something that could definitely be possible. It just wasn't an option in a public setting like the one that I had access to.
Sure. Did you replace or refresh the water in the tanks during the 6 months? Or was it the same water throughout the whole entire period?
So we did. So I did, and I also had my coworkers do it while I was away. Refresh the water because the water would evaporate because it was just sitting out under fans in our in our range that we have at the lab. So the water would evaporate. So more water from the river would be put in, which would mix in with the rusty water, the water that the firearms had been sitting in. So yeah, water was refreshed from time to time.
Next question I have here. Were you the only examiner that performed the comparisons, or were they compared by other examiners or multiple examiners?
From what I recall, a majority of the comparisons were done by me. If there was a question about them, I believe I did bring in another examiner or an examiner from my section to kind of look at them to see what their opinion was. But all the comparisons were at the very least done primarily by me.
Another question about the design of the project, specifically the water. You mentioned at the tail end of your presentation the different types of water may be being used, and I guess expanding on that, do you think choosing either just freshwater or just saltwater would alter the results of the experiment?
I think it very well could be, because obviously salt water will rust metal in general quicker than pure fresh water. So using pure salt water like from the ocean versus the brackish water that I used, it could very well alter the results of the project, and it'd definitely be something to consider for future work.
Sure, absolutely. Do you think the length of time submerged before an identification becomes impossible if that's dependent on the manufacturer, the make of the firearm?
It could very well be. Maybe not necessarily. I guess the manufacturer, in the sense that different manufacturers use different metals, different finishes on their firearms compared to others. That I would very much assume would have an effect. For instance, there are manufacturers that are considered make what are considered lower grade firearms that may use cheaper metals or lower quality metals than, say, some more expensive manufacturers or manufacturers that make more expensive or higher quality firearms. So in that aspect, then yes, I think could be considered manufacturer based. But at the same time, well-known manufacturers do make maybe lower grade firearms versus higher grade firearms for different clientele, try to get into those levels of, what people are looking for in a firearm, or have the possibility of people being able to afford firearms. So it could, it could definitely depend on the manufacturer.
Sure, absolutely. Another question here, kind of about the project's design. How many test fires did you obtain at each stage? Can you go into detail of that again?
Yeah, so I took 4 test fires from the firearm as it was received from the property and evidence section. So before the firearms were put into the tank to rust. And then when the firearms were taken out of the tank and restored, after they were restored, 4 additional test fires were taken. So for each comparison, I had 4 pre-rust, and for each firearm, I had 4 pre-rust test fires and then 4 post-rust test fires.
And then I have a question very much related to which which of the test fired cartridges or bullets did you take out for the actual comparison?
I looked at so out of the 4 from each, so 4 from the pre, 4 from the post, I
Yeah.
did a combination of there wasn't a specific one from each. I didn't pick, number 2 from the pre and number 3 from the post. I looked at I took each one I took multiples out of the boxes and compared them underneath the comparison microscope for each firearm. So there were multiple comparisons made for each firearm between the pre and the post rust, as well as pre to pre and post to post.
Gotcha. Going back before even talking about those pre-rust bullets, specifically the Glock ones, were you able to ID those pre-rust Glock bullets to each other? Because I know throughout the common thread was that the Glock bullets were the ones that were trickier, unidentifiable once it was rusted.
Naturally, Glock projectiles could possibly be considered trickier to identify just because of the type of rifling. I don't recall specifically which ones I made an ID on or which ones were considered more of an inconclusive, but I knew that the test fires came from the specific firearm. So I was able to then still compare the pre-rust to the post-rust samples, since I know which firearms they came from. I still have the samples, so in order to improve on the project, I could always go back and relook at whatever samples I do have and make further identifications, inconclusives, look at the samples again to see if, because I've also grown as an examiner and my experience as an examiner. So I could easily look at those samples again and see if my conclusions have possibly changed.
Sure. Now, you mentioned certain other parts of the internal workings of the firearms, especially in the weapons that the firearms that had been rusted for several months. Some of those components were completely rusted out or damaged beyond function. But I have a question here asking, did you actually examine some of those features like the firing pin or the chamber detail at the same level of detail as the cartridges, or was it strictly to just make sure that it was the firearm was functioning to be able to do the test fires?
So in order for the firearm to be functional, those components have to work. They have to be functional. So if the firing pin is not functional, then it can't be cocked to the rear, released, and then striking the primer, thus causing the cartridge to detonate. So as part of function testing the firearms, both pre-rust and post-rust, all those components were taken into consideration in order to, I guess, make sure that the firearm would function. I believe hopefully that answered the question.
What did you use to clean and remove the rust after the water exposure? I think you mentioned it once in your presentation, but do you mind going into a little detail on kind of what your overall restoration and cleaning procedure was for each stage of the project?
Sure. So I to prep for the project, I had purchased some rust remover. I'd also purchased a sandblasting cabinet just in case we thought that we would need that. But it turned out that at this point, a lot of the firearms you could simply just clean with some fresh water running over it and some nylon brushes to really kind of scrub whatever could be whatever rust could be removed. So that was the primary method, was just strip the firearms, get some clean water running through them, scrub them really well with some nylon brushes. Then once they were thoroughly scrubbed, dry them off, lubricate them with some gun oil. Patches and bore solvent were run through the barrels in order to clean out the barrels. And they were reassembled with some gun oil and, function tested and test fired.
It's definitely speaks to the engineering of these firearms for them to be able to, after just some quick restoration and cleaning, to be able to still fire even with that much rust damage. It's pretty wild to think about. Another question I have here, actually, I kind of wanted to bring up this comment from somebody in the audience because I think it's something I'd love to get your kind of opinion on based off of the findings in your project, and also just your experience overall. They had this audience member had a case where the gun had been sitting in water for well over a year and completely sealed shut, completely cemented shut. But because it was loaded, they believed that the live cartridge that was in the chamber kind of protected the breech face, kind of sealed it off from water getting in, or at least mostly water getting in. And I was curious to get your take on, what you saw in this experiment, if you think that that's plausible, feasible. I don't know, just really wanting to get your reaction to kind of that thought.
It could very well be. I didn't rust any of my firearms with loaded chambers. A, because of safety reasons, because the firearms were just sitting, and B, I wanted to just have them as firearms sitting in the tank rusting. As I mentioned, one of the papers that I did as part of my research for this project, one of the papers mentioned that the firearm in their paper was found with a suppressor and a cartridge casing found in the chamber. And he contributed the ability to make an identification to the fact that the suppressor was on the firearm, which could have prevented some water, or prevented the barrel from getting as rusted, deteriorated as it could, and then also the cartridge casing inside of the chamber possibly supporting and protecting the breech face of the firearm. So it's a possibility. I didn't look at that as part of my project, but again, it could be something that could be done for future research, or if somebody wanted to replicate the project with loaded chambers with a cartridge in there, or fire cartridges and then put a spent cartridge casing inside the chamber and then rust the firearms. Suppressors could be attached if somebody wants to rust a bunch of suppressors. There are so many different variables that could be taken with this project and done, that anything is possible. So it'd be interesting to look at. But I would say that because the head of the cartridge casing is right up against the breech face of the firearm, it very well could protect the metal from deteriorating on the breech face. Yeah, that's my thoughts on it. Yeah, it's very well could be could be possible.
Sure. Yeah. The trickiest part about any of these experiments is trying to simulate real world situations. There's so many different variables and things to have to consider that it'll take doing this type of experiment over and over again to even get remotely close to getting that type of data. I know this was obviously not the focus of your project, your experiment in particular, but this is a great question. I'm curious if maybe something you might have noticed or picked up on while, especially you were restoring and cleaning up the guns. Somebody from the audience asked, what was the variations over time on the serial numbers, and if the rust obliterated those serial numbers? Did you notice or happen to pick up on if those were starting to fade away or get distorted in any way?
I'm going to be completely honest, I didn't really even look at the serial numbers to notice if that was the case. Obviously, I noticed that there were, on all metal components, there were, varying degrees of rust film and, everything all over the firearms, depending on, how long that they've been sitting. But I didn't specifically look at the serial number plates or the metal that the serial number was engraved into. I actually still have the firearms somewhere sitting in the lab in a box. So that'd be something that, as a follow-up to this project, I could easily look at to see if the serial numbers are still legible. I really didn't consider that as the pre-rust, so having something to compare the post-rust to, there really wouldn't be anything. I didn't take photos of the serial numbers pre-rust, so all I would have is the post-rust. But at the very least, take a look at them and see if they're legible, if they would be considered needing restoration, which is something that we do as part of the section in the crime lab. So that'd be something I could absolutely look at for future consideration.
Sure. And again, like I mentioned, that obviously wasn't part of it wasn't the primary focus of your experiment. Just definitely something if you noticed, but it's seeing the extreme pitting and distortion that the more rusted, the longer sitting in the water firearms had. It'd definitely be something curious to see how much impact that had on the plate that the serial number is on. Another question I have here: were the Glocks that were used in the experiment all from the same generation?
No, if I recall properly, I didn't take into consideration the generations. I know the experiment was done, I believe, either before or right as the new Gen 5s were coming out. So I didn't have any Gen 5s. I would have had Gen 4s, Gen 3s, maybe even some Gen 2s and Gen 1s, which I know to some gun enthusiasts would be a little bit shocking. That would rust some very early generation Glocks. But yeah, there were no Gen 5s because I'm familiar with what the Gen 5s look like. So they would have all been generation 4s and earlier. So yeah, there were multiple generations. I just didn't take into consideration picking specific generations for the experiments. I was able to pick a bunch of Glocks from the inventory at property and evidence to use for the project. So no specific generations were not taken into considerations, but that's something else that could be done as a follow-up for the project, because there could be specific types of metals or metal classifications that were used between different generations, especially with Glock. Glock is an excellent example where that could be done, because you have clear generational gaps or generations in the series. So different types of metals could have been used in each generation. The components are made of different metals. So somebody could easily do this same project with specifically Glocks and just focus on comparing different generations to see if the specific makeup of the metal or metallurgy would have an effect.
Actually, in the same line of that, talking about kind of the pool of available firearms for you to use for the experiment, I have a question from the audience asking if you could go into detail kind of on what are the criteria to have the guns be slated for destruction from your crime lab?
So it's not necessarily from the crime lab specifically. So all firearms that come into the crime lab are not retained by the crime lab. They are given back to the host agency, the submitting agency for which the guns were submitted from. Because our lab is we're the Broward Sheriff's Office crime labs, our host agency that we work for is the Broward Sheriff's Office. So whatever guns that the Sheriff's Office takes in as evidence, they get worked, they get returned, and then after a certain period of time, the guns are no longer needed for court purposes, or they've gone through court, the case has been closed out, everything's been settled as far as the case, and then the guns are often what are called slated or turned in or destroyed by Broward Sheriff's Office. So instead of the guns being destroyed, oftentimes you're either shredded or incinerated, I believe, is what our agency does. I had the opportunity to take some of those firearms that were slated for destruction and use them as part of my project. So they were firearms that were either turned in to the agency that weren't part of a criminal case that were going to be destroyed, or they were guns that were involved in criminal cases, had gone through the process, the case was closed out through the courts, and that the guns were going to be destroyed. Oftentimes guns, to my knowledge, are not returned back out onto the streets or resold, at least through my agency, unless they were stolen firearms and are being returned to the original owners or other certain circumstances.
Gotcha. We've got time for one more question. So I'd like to finish off with, you mentioned in the experiment that especially with the later stage firearms that had certain parts of the internal workings literally crumble apart or just stop it from the firearm being able to function, that you had to use reference parts from reference firearms in the lab. Is that I don't want to ask, is that a common practice as much as how often does that occur where you may have to piece together some parts from reference firearms in the lab to be able to get a test fire? And have you seen any of that be an impact on evidence in the case for that particular situation?
So we do have the option of doing that in the crime lab as part of regular everyday casework. We have, and a lot of crime labs have, firearm sections have what's called a reference collection. So firearms that have been collected over the years from old cases, again, firearms that have been slated for destruction, that the crime lab can then take on as part of their reference collection, primarily used for educational purposes to help train new examiners on different kinds of firearms, different types of actions, everything like that. But one thing the reference collection is also used for are parts. So if we get a gun in that is not functional, but it's needed, but the firearm is needed to be functional in order for comparison purposes. Most commonly, we use it most commonly in your homicide cases where, having test fires from the submitted evidence gun is truly necessary in order to perform the comparisons. We have the ability to take guns from the reference collection, similar guns or the exact same model of gun, take parts from that gun and use them in the evidence gun to make them functional. Now, parts such as barrels and firing pins and breech faces, the rear of the slide, which would be considered a breech face, those are oftentimes not swapped out for reference parts because those are the parts of the firearm that have the working surfaces that impose detail onto the cartridge cases and the projectiles, which we use to do our comparisons and possibly make identifications. So those parts we try, at least in my lab, we try not to swap out because those are the parts that actually are needed to do comparison work. If we do need to use them, then obviously we make note of it and not take those areas, those working surfaces into consideration when making the comparisons. Obviously, when a firearm comes in as non-functioning or inoperable, we make note of that, and then we write notes on what we did using reference parts to make the firearm operable, so that if we need to go to court, we can explain our process, explain why we had to do it. But for parts, if a gun comes in as part of a homicide case where it's not functional because of a broken trigger spring, that doesn't have any influence on the working surfaces, the breech face, the firing pin, anything that we really look at in order to, under a comparison microscope, to make comparisons. So we'll mark it as inoperable in whatever notes that we're taking. We then will say, using a reference firearm, we were able to replace the trigger spring or swap out the trigger spring on the evidence gun, thus making it up functional, and we were able to get test fires from that firearm because of that. So it's common. I would say my crime lab has done it, depending on the type of case and if it's needed, but it's a common practice to do. And the reason we did it as part of the project is because I wanted test fires to do the pre to post rust comparisons to. So if I could use reference collection firearms to get parts to make the firearm operable, that was in my best interest to do in order to perform the comparisons and move the project forward.
Sure, absolutely. Well, we have run out of time. So we'll go ahead and start wrapping things up and start by saying thank you to our presenter for taking the time out of his day to present the material for today's webinar and answer all these wonderful questions. So David, thank you for taking that time to provide your presentation and your findings.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it, the opportunity, and thank you everybody for watching and sticking around.
Thanks, David. Really appreciate it. So we're going to go ahead and get your contact information up on the page, just so in case anybody has any additional questions, they can reach out to you. Get that up there here in a second. Before you leave today's webinar, we ask if you could participate in a short 5-minute survey. You will see a checkbox icon directly above the chat. Simply click that button to be linked to the audience feedback survey for today's event. Your feedback about our webinars is critical information that helps us improve and continue to provide you the best webinar experience possible. If you could please take those few moments to complete the survey, we would greatly appreciate it. Lastly, across the top of the live stream window are links to all our social media profiles, including Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook, a link to our website at forensiccoe.org, and a link to listen to episodes of the FTCOE's podcast, Just Science. There's also a link to sign up for the FTCOE newsletter so you can stay up to date with everything that FTCOE is doing in support of the forensic community. Thank you again for attending, and we hope everyone has a great day.